Let's talk about the 3 major painting techniques that are gonna get you painting like a pro, no matter what your skill level. And know that these methods are more than just for zombies. They're great tricks to use in any of your makeup creations. Now, if you want to see how to make your own easy texture panels or even the latex bald cap, I have links to those videos in the description below. I'm starting out with a pretty light base so that you can see the textures a little more. Obviously, you can go more subtle or more extreme. Now that we have a quick base, let's talk about the first texture technique. This is going to be modeling, or also called noodling. This effect is what's going to give the skin a translucent look. You're going to want an airbrush for this, but don't worry, you do not have to be proficient at airbrushing for this effect to work. The idea is that you're layering figure 8s. I'm not creating perfectly round 8s, just going around and making them all different sizes, getting closer to the skin, farther away from the skin. As you layer this more and more, you're going to get a really cool effect. That's why this is really great if you're new to airbrushing. You don't have that much control because you don't need to be precise. You may have noticed that I only put the texture on one side of my body. I just really wanted to show that these painting techniques are gonna work great whether you have prosthetics or not. The next technique is gonna be contouring. Now, this is something to do by hand with eyeshadows or creams or an airbrush. I do prefer airbrush for the speed, but that's not to say I won't pull out a makeup brush to get a smaller area. When doing zombies, you wanna be familiar with the skeletal system because that's where your shadows are gonna be, anywhere in between the bones. So the more you familiarize yourself, the better your zombies are gonna come out. Unless the makeup is in a dark environment, say like a Halloween haunt, I usually like to shade with a dark brown and save that black for the deepest part of the shadows. And if you're not too familiar with how the bones are structured in the face, go ahead and lightly press in there and see where the edge of the bone is, and that's where you're going to want your darker edge of the shadow and then kind of fading into that hollow, giving it a very emaciated look, like the skin's drying out and starting to press up against the skull. This might take a little practice of just getting used to the structure of the skull to really get better effects. I like to make the shadows a little blotchy, especially with something where it's rotten flesh. It just gives it kind of more of a texture than a solid straight shaded line. We're gonna go in and we're gonna do the nose area where the skin would kind of collapse into that nose bone. Now, just doing the body, you're gonna just want to augment the collarbone and the rib cage. Another way I find to get more of organic shading is try not to do like blunt straight lines. Just kind of focus on certain areas. Like, so for here, I focus in the inner part and the outer part, and then it's lighter towards the middle. When doing the chest, don't forget there is a sternum bone in that center, so you don't want to just do straight lines across to do your ribs. You don't have to worry about being exactly true to the anatomy. It just helps that if you have a reference, that it's just gonna look better overall and a little more natural. Also, just doing a little shading on the tip of the nose, that's gonna push it back and make it look like it's collapsing more. Now I'm gonna go in with some Mayron black and just do certain areas. Again, I just don't want like perfectly straight lines everywhere. So if you're using a makeup brush to shade and you want to get some of those textures that you can achieve with an airbrush, you can basically just go in and just kind of wiggle the brush around, and that's just going to create some interesting islands of color and texture. And also, don't be afraid to change out your makeup brush because they're all going to give you different effects, and depending on where you're working, you might find it more comfortable to work with a larger brush or a smaller brush. Again, I'm just kind of picking areas, making the shading really blotchy. So I'm going to go ahead and color in the deep parts of the prosthetics, and I did some veining for this look. There's a full video on the techniques on how to hand paint and even airbrush veins down in the description. Now we're going to talk about the next technique. This technique is breakup. So if you have any straight lines or something that's a little too exaggerated that you don't like, this is the step that's going to kind of correct that. So here's the 3 different ways to break up your paint job. First one is spatter. You can either do this by hand or with an airbrush. When doing it by hand, you can use a toothbrush or a dye brush. Delium even makes a spatter brush. Or if you have chip brushes, you can cut off the top and create your own spatter brush. You're going to want to thin your makeup down. This is going to give you a translucent speckle. Now, if you have less liquid, you're going to get more freckling and a darker pattern. You might want this for a certain character. Usually when spattering, I do like to do a lighter tone and a darker tone and just layer those. I find that introducing more colors is gonna give it more of a cool look. You can either flick the paint with your finger, or if you want to keep your hands clean, go ahead and use a tongue depressor. The second method is stippling. So here I have 2 Delium brushes. Work great for just getting breakup and you just stipple your color. You can also use this method to help build up some of the shadow areas or the highlight areas. I'm just gonna lightly tap. If you're using water activated or alcohol activated colors, you're gonna wanna make sure that your mixture is pretty dry. Again, the more you layer, the more interesting and natural it can look. Stippling is a great way to also build up some of those highlight points really subtly. So all of these techniques can be adapted to your own creation, and just know that you can mix and match them for your character. So the third method for breakup is going to be stamping. And that's when you take a makeup sponge and you're going to tear texture into the bottom of it. You want to try to make sure that you break up the edges because you don't want to stamp straight lines onto your work. The stamping method also works really well when you're highlighting high texture prosthetics like this, because as you go into the regular skin, it still has a pattern and kind of hides that prosthetic edge. Now, one of the nice things about the stamping method is it gives you a similar effect as the modeling did earlier. So if you don't have an airbrush, then the stamping can give you a very similar effect. You can use all 3 together and keep layering, or just choose 1 or 2 that you just really like the technique of. As you can see, even without texture prosthetics, it still gives you a really effective zombie. I'm going to add some of these juicy looking silicone veins. If you want to know how to create these veins yourself, be sure to check out the link in the description. I'm going to tie it all together with some scaleras and some tasty mouth effects in down brown. So all these techniques can be adapted to your personal makeup, whether it be fantasy or monsters. And if you want to see more about how to airbrush certain textures for fantasy creatures, be sure to check out the next video.